We have been talking so far on the microscopic aspects of electron microscope. Start to it, what is the resolution that we can achieve in optical microscopy, and the problems with optical microscopy in terms of various aberrations. We have talked about it, the spherical, the chromatic aberration, and how to overcome them. We have also talked, and what is the limit of resolution that you can achieve in an optical microscope. And then we saw that you cannot get resolutions beyond around 200 nanometers. That means if you have any two spots or any precipitate smaller than that 200 nanometers, it is very difficult to see them using an optical microscope, whatever lens that you use, however very good lens that you use, because it is limited not by actually lens, it is limited by the wavelength that you are using. Okay, so the wavelength in an optical radiation being limited, being nothing but the range of wavelengths that we have, you can possibly improve that further by using filters, particularly filters of lower wavelengths. Let's say a blue filter. Which limits, and the best lenses that you use also would only give you that. If you don't use best lenses, you would not achieve even that particular resolution which that wavelength offers to you. Okay, so the resolution can be only worsened by the lens, but it cannot be improved by the lens. So that's the limitation that we need to know. And as a result, we thought the best way to get finer resolutions, better resolutions is to go to microscopes where I can use smaller wavelengths. And that's where electron microscopes have become very popular. And in electron microscopes, we have been talking in last few classes on particularly a particular type of microscope called TEF, transmission electron microscope. Electron microscopes are of two types, we said, scanning electron microscope and transmission electron microscope. And particularly transmission electron microscope being a microscope which gives you very high resolutions, because we use higher voltages there. Simple difference between these two, if you look at it, the voltages that we use are in the range of 20 to 30 kV for a scanning electron microscope, and for a transmission electron microscope it ranges from anywhere from 80 kV onwards. And as I mentioned in the previous class, I have even seen a microscope which has 3000 kV. But generally you don't use such a high kV because in recent times people have known that there is no point in going to very high voltages. The reason why people earlier days thought of going to very high voltages is from this equation, E equal to hc by lambda or h nu. That is what all of us know. So if I want to have a smaller lambda, if I use a higher voltage, I can get a smaller lambda. So I generate electrons. I allow these electrons to move towards the sample with a large voltage potential. So if I apply a large voltage potential, the electrons will start moving towards the sample with that energy decided by the voltage that I am applying from the region where I have generated the electrons, which is called the gun. And these electrons are generated either by field emission process or a thermionic emission process. And once you generate them and you allow them to go through the sample, and this particular voltage that I use decides the lambda. And if I want to have a better and better resolution, I should have a smaller and smaller lambda, was what the original knowledge that people had. And as a result, people even went up to 3000 kV microscopes also. But then later people realized that if I use 100 kV, 100 kV itself gives me a lambda of 0.037 angstroms. 0.04 angstroms I get. If I go to 200 kV, I will approximately get about 0.025 angstroms. So just by going to 100 or 200 kV, I am able to get something of this range. So this is much smaller than the sizes of the atoms. Most of the interatomic distances that we know are all of that order of around 1 angstrom or so. For example, when we talk atomic sizes are all measured in terms of angstroms, right? Okay, so they range from around half of the angstrom to about 1 angstrom or so, or maybe ranging from 0.1 angstrom to about 1 angstrom. This is the typical range of most of the interatomic, what are called the atomic sizes, and particularly if you are talking about crystal structures, where we are concerned more about the unit cells and interatomic distances. For example, lattice parameter. Lattice parameter is nothing but the distance between the atoms in the x or y z direction. So these distances are usually of the order of an angstrom or even more in some cases. There are some crystal structures which have a larger unit cell, and as a result, we don't need to really go to lambdas smaller than that. As a result, people have said that we should be able to use a lambda which is of this order itself and be able to see the atoms. But the problem why, though the lambda is this small, we are not able to get a resolution. In principle, if this is a lambda, this divided by 2 should give me the resolution, which is 0.01 angstrom. Whereas we don't get a resolution of 0.01 angstrom. A 100 kV microscope usually gives you 1 nanometer resolution. Whereas an optical microscope gives you how much resolution? 0.2 microns, 200 nanometers resolution. So from 200 nanometers, if I go to 100 kV microscope, I am able to get about 1 nanometer. This is the general resolution that we get. The reason for this difference, though this divided by 2 tells me approximately 0.02 angstroms, that means 0.002 nanometer should be my resolution. But I get this. The reason is there are so many aberrations in these microscopes. Any microscope, basic principle is certain radiation is used to image the sample, and this radiation, whichever radiation, whether it is optical or electron radiation that I am using, this radiation or that ray has to be focused on the sample. And to focus anything, you need a lens, right? In an optical microscope also, I use an objective lens, I use what is called an eyepiece. So these are the two things which focus the sample and magnify the sample, and that is how I am able to see. And here in an electron microscope, we use magnetic lenses rather than normal optical lenses to focus. And even magnetic lenses have their own aberrations, chromatic aberrations, spherical aberrations, all these are there. And it is those aberrations which limit the resolution, and you are not able to achieve the resolution which the lambda offers, which the small lambda is able to offer. And the only way to improve is, instead of going to very small, very large voltages, which will give you very much smaller lambdas, because already even with this lambda, you are not able to achieve very high resolution. If you further go down to smaller and smaller lambda, you may be able to get better than this 1 nanometer, maybe 5 angstroms or 2 angstroms or 3 angstroms. But the best way is to use these lambdas itself and correct the aberrations. We have now what are called aberration. So there are aberration corrected TEMs that are available, though they are quite expensive. They cost about 15 to 25 crores, but they are available, and where people are correcting these aberrations by correcting the magnetic lenses. The aberrations generated by these magnetic lenses is most of electronic stuff. I would not go into the details of that, but one can do the corrections, and with those corrections, people are able to achieve about 0.5 angstroms to be the best resolution. This has been achieved, this has been demonstrated by now, and there are microscopes that are available in this world which will give you that kind of resolution. So this is all about microscopy. We talked about it already. and we say that in principle achieve this. And when you can achieve this, you can see variety of things. You can see, for example, precipitates, which may be of the order of around starting from about 1 nanometer to about 100 nanometer sizes of precipitates, because whenever I say precipitate, precipitates always formed by a nucleation and growth process. So at the stage of nucleation, they are all very small. Okay, most of the nuclei are of the order of around, let's say, 1 nanometer or so. Nucleus is nothing but of atoms having a particular size called R star. That is the definition of a nucleus, right? So that R star is usually of the order of around 1 nanometer or so, 1 or 2 nanometers. So this kind of a size, if I want to see, I can easily see, because now microscopes can show you that. And then you can also go to the next level of seeing what are called atoms and atomic arrays inside a material. If I want to see a dislocation for that matter, we can also see those dislocations. Maybe today we will talk a little bit about how to see these dislocations once we start talking about the diffraction in electron microscope. So you can see atomic resolutions in an electron microscope. You can also see higher than the atomic resolution. That means you can also see particles, precipitate particles. You can see grain sizes. Of course, most of these things like grain sizes and coarse particles, I don't need to even go to an electron microscope. I can even see them in an optical microscope. So we do not use an electron microscope to see all those that you see in an optical microscope, because there is no point in wasting your time and energy and money, because a normal TEM without an aberration correction would cost about 3.5 to 4 crores. And an optical microscope would not cost you more than 5 lakhs. So there is no point in really buying a TEM if your interest is only to see a grain size. So unless the grain size is of the order of nanometers. For example, nowadays we are talking of nanomaterials. A lot of people are working on nanomaterials where the grains can vary anywhere between 100 nanometers. We usually define any material as nanomaterial only when its dimensions are smaller than 100 nanometers. Any one of the dimensions. For example, we call a rod as a nano rod when its diameter is less than 100 nanometers. The length can be anything, but as long as the diameter is less than 100 nanometers, we usually call it as a nanomaterial. Of course, this is not a very fixed number. It depends on what kind of property that we are looking at. But let's not go into the details of it, but generally all these can be seen using such microscopes, because I cannot see them in an optical microscope. So I should be able to use these instruments for all those purposes which cannot be achieved by an optical microscope. So, but as I said, because this is a transmission electron microscope, TEM, the electron beam goes through a sample and then gets focused on the image. You see it on a screen at the bottom of the sample. So because the electron beam is generated somewhere in an electron gun and goes through because of certain lenses, you have what are called condenser lenses, you have another what is called an objective lens, and then you have the sample usually kept near the objective lens. Then finally you have also what is called imaging lens, and you have the actual image formed on a screen. And because you have this the electron beam going through the sample has to be very thin, and the thickness that we allow is not more than usually about 100 nanometers. So in the last class we talked a lot about how to prepare these samples of that. There's one point which I missed out talking in the last class about the sample preparation. Traditionally, I should say, historically, possibly I should mention that people were using techniques what are called replica techniques. All the techniques that I talked yesterday, for example, whether it is jet polishing for conducting samples or ion milling for non-conducting samples. Though we mentioned yesterday that ion milling is used for non-conducting samples, you can also use ion milling for even conducting samples whenever you see that the sample is very reactive. For example, if I have a titanium alloy, if I put this titanium alloy sample into an electrolyte and allow it to dissolve using a jet polishing technique, you see that in the process it may get oxidized. So you may have a thin oxide layer forming on the surface, and which disturbs the microstructure that you are seeing. As a result, you need to possibly go to a technique where such an oxide layers cannot be formed. And in an ion milling, basically because you are putting your sample inside a chamber which is completely evacuated and filled with argon, and that argon is allowed to form like a beam on the sample to sputter away the atoms. So as a result, the chances that the sample is exposed to oxygen is not there, and as a result you can have. So all reactive metals are usually done by ion milling, though in principle they are conducting and they can be prepared using jet polishing. So these are the techniques which have been developed much later, and the original techniques were called replica techniques, where what people wanted to see is, if you want to see certain let's say precipitate particles or inclusions or even grain boundaries in your sample, what people used to do is they used to thin, if this is your sample with some grain boundaries, let us say, or some particles, let us say, so you usually polish your sample surface, and when you polish your surface, if you have some let's say hard particles which are inclusions, let us say, usually these hard particles are not polished easily when compared to your sample, because if your sample is less hard than the particle, for example, if I have an aluminum alloy with some inclusions, alumina inclusions, or if it is a steel with some inclusions of either silica inclusions or some other inclusions which have been formed during the preparation of the steel, and the slag inclusions which are entrapped into your material, and these are all because they are all oxides, they are very hard when compared to the sample. So when you are polishing on an emery paper or even a cloth polishing at the final stage, you will see that the metal gets polished more easily, whereas these particles do not get polished. As a result, you will see that the particles actually protrude out because they are not polished. The metal is polished, so you will see that the particles actually are projecting out of the sample because they have not been polished. And now what people regularly do, used to do long back, is to deposit a thin carbon coating, or there are other materials, polymer kind of materials called formwar, or carbon. Most commonly used is carbon or formwar. This kind of a thin coating of the order of around just about a micron or so, or micron or 10 micron kind of coating is deposited on the surface, and then after it is deposited, it is just peeled off by some method. If you can put some kind of a soap solution or something like that on the surface, so that there is not a very good contact between the two, and it can be peeled off after the deposition has taken place. When you peel it off and see this particular coating alone, coated film alone, you will basically see something like this, because you will see the negative of the top surface, right? So wherever there are projections, these projections will look like a dimples now. So by now putting this sample, which is very thin and electron transparent, we said that for the sample to be observed in a electron microscope, it has to be transparent. It should be very thin. So if you can produce a material which is less than about a micron or so, or you can actually, because these are all done by deposition techniques like what is called sputter deposition techniques, you can actually control and even get thin films of the order of around 100 to 200 nanometers without much problem. And if you can produce such a thin film and peel it off and then put it into the microscope and see, what you actually see is this kind of dimples, and from that you can get an idea of what were the shape and sizes of those inclusions or precipitates inside your material. You will not be able to know what is that particular precipitate from this technique. You will only know the sizes and shapes and possibly the distribution of those precipitates or the inclusions inside your sample. And even if there are certain grain boundaries, it is possible, if I can etch this surface and then deposit. If there is a groove that is formed, obviously this particular film also goes into that groove, and you will also possibly see this because it is going into the groove. So you will see this as something like this. So wherever there is a grain boundary, you would see the grain boundary is like a projected now. So from that, and this will look, because I am only talking about this region, actually it is like a film. Because it is a film and grain boundary looks like a line, and you will see like a projected groove kind of thing which is projected outside like a line, and from that you can find out, yes, this is the grain boundary and these were possibly the grain sizes. All these informations can be obtained from this. But the difficulty with this technique is you will not know what precipitates were there, because you are actually not getting the precipitate, you are only getting the image of the precipitate, impression of the precipitate, right? And in order to get that, people started using what is called extraction replicas. What they used to do is, they used to do a deep etching of the surface before this deposition. That means put an etchant, concentrated etchant, and do it for a longer period of etching, so that these particles which are there are at the interface between these two, the matrix and the particle, the etchant will attack, and as a result these particles start getting loosened and they start sitting on the surface as a loose particles because you have etched them away. And now if you actually deposit your carbon film or formwork film and try to pull it off, there is a probability that these loose particles may get embedded into that particular formwork and come out. So when you actually see this, you may possibly find a particle embedded into it. One of these particles or some of these particles which may get embedded into it, and now you are not just simply seeing the carbon, a carbon into which these particles got embedded. And this is an good situation for us, because I can now see what these particles. In addition, the rest of the information like grain boundaries, all those things also you will be able to see, but you will also be able to see what these particles are. Is it theta double prime? Is it theta prime? Or is it theta? I will be able to know. How do I come to know? Because I can get a diffraction from this particle. And that's the advantage of these microscopes. These microscopes are not only microscopes to give you information on sizes and shapes and size distribution of particles, but you can also use the electron beam like an X-ray beam in order to get a diffraction pattern. And that's what exactly we are going to jump into in the next few minutes from now. That I can put this beam, electron beam, on this particle and get a diffraction pattern from that, and analyze this diffraction pattern and come to know what is the crystal structure of that. And I know pretty well that the theta double prime, theta prime and theta, if I look at all of them, they will have, though the crystal structure is the same, their lattice parameters are different. Right? GP zones alone are basically the FCC clusters of copper, mostly. That is what people assume it or believe it, though nobody has actually proven it, exact composition of those GP zones. But people know definitely that they are all FCC clusters. But now if you come to theta double prime, theta prime and theta, they are all crystals which have similar crystal structure as that of theta, excepting that their lattice parameters are different from that of theta, and slowly move towards that of theta as the precipitates start growing. So what is the crystal structure of theta? Anybody knows? Al2Cu. What is the crystal structure of Fe3C? Orthorhombic. You know it. So for example, if I take a martensite and do tempering of martensite, you have all gone through the heat treatment course, right? So what do I get out of this martensite when I do tempering? I take a steel martensite and do tempering. What comes out? First of all, carbon is not sitting as particles. Okay. For example, if I ask you what is ferrite or what is austenite, can somebody define austenite and ferrite? Solid solution of what in what? What is solute? What is solvent? Solute is iron. Solvent is correct. So what kind of a solid solution it is? Yes, it's the interstitial solid solution of carbon in iron. And this iron can exist in different forms. So as a result, this interstitial solid solutions of carbon in iron, depending on which iron it is, we give a different name. So if I say ferrite, for example, alpha ferrite, so it is a solid solution of interstitial solid solution of carbon in what iron? Ferrite is alpha iron, which is a BCC iron. Similarly, when I say austenite, it is the interstitial solid solution of carbon in gamma iron, which is an FCC iron. Similarly, there is something called delta ferrite, which is an interstitial solid solution of carbon in delta iron, which is again a BCC. This is the definition. Definitions have to be very crisp. Now, if I come to martensite, can we have a similar definition for martensite? Is martensite a compound? Tell me, is it a compound or is it a solid solution? It's a solid solution. So if so, what is that? Supersaturated, okay, solid solution of what in what? Of what in what? Of copper in aluminum? Copper in iron? I just confused you. Carbon in BCT iron. That's it. Only in steels. Please remember this. It is the supersaturated or whatever you want to say. It's a interstitial solid solution of carbon in BCT iron. That is a martensite in steels. Why I have to tell you this very clearly is that there can be martensites which are not BCT. For example, if I get a martensite in pure iron where there is no carbon, that martensite will be having what structure? Anybody can tell me? Pure iron martensite. If at all there is a martensite, how do I get martensite? Heat the steel to high temperature, quench it. Right? That is how. So I am suppressing the perlite formation. That is how I get a martensite. And if I take a pure iron, heat it to austenite. I mean, I don't call it as austenite anymore because this is pure iron. So I should call it as what? I should call it as gamma. Don't go to. Do we go to liquidus temperature to get martensite in steels? No. Where do we go? Austenitization we say. And what is that temperature above which we have austenite? 910. That is for what? 910 is for what? For pure iron. But if I am considering a steel, let's say 0.4% or 0.6% carbon steel, then what is the temperature above which I have to heat to get an austenite? What is that temperature called? There is a terminology given to that. It is called A3 temperature. AC3 to be exact because we are heating it, right? So that A3, if I go beyond A3, I have austenite. So similarly for a pure iron, if I go beyond 910, I am going to the austenite. Of course, beyond 910, not up to the liquidus as she said, but below the liquidus, much below the liquidus. And what is the domain where the gamma is stable in a pure iron? 910 to 15. Sure. 1493 is your peritectic temperature. See, we used to say when we were students that if you are a metallurgist, even if somebody wakes you up in the sleep, you should be able to draw your iron carbon diagram. Because iron carbon diagram is supposed to be the bread and butter of metallurgists. You are all supposed to be proud metallurgists. If you answer like this, if a Tata Steel fellow comes tomorrow for taking interviews for all of you, he will never take any honor. Please be very thorough with your basics of metallurgy. Otherwise, you will end up into software jobs because they don't want all this information anyway. And if you want to be satisfied with that, be happy and go to those software. But if you want to remain as a good material scientist, your material science concepts have to be very, very clear. Please develop that. Anyway, so it is 910 to 1400 actually. 1493 is actually the peritectic temperature. So it is that domain. If I heat the pure iron, quench it from there, I get a martensite. I don't need to only take steels and quench it to get a martensite. I can take a pure iron also to that particular temperature where it is a gamma iron. Take it to gamma iron, do not cool it slowly, quench it. If I cool it slowly, it will become alpha iron. If I quench it, I get a martensite. But this martensite will be a BCC martensite. It will not be a BCT martensite. Why is it so? I will not tell you now. You can read your physical metallurgy, you will know. Because we are talking of materials characterization, we will only stick to that for the time. So now why I had to ask you this question is, if I take a martensite, let's say steel martensite, 0.4% carbon or 0.8% carbon for that matter, and start heating it, do tempering. And people say that I get tempered martensite. My question is, what does this tempered martensite contain if I see the microstructure? Let's say I heat a martensite to 200 or 300 degrees centigrade. And I see this sample which is cooled back to room temperature after being heated to 300 degrees for about 1 hour or 2 hours. And this sample, I am putting it into my optical microscope. What do I see? You get tempered martensite, but that's true. But everything, all tempered structures are all called tempered martensite. But what is the microstructure consists of? The microstructure consists of basically a ferrite plus some carbide. Because martensite, as you have already defined, is a supersaturated solid solution of carbon. And because it is supersaturated, carbon does not want to remain inside the martensite, and if you provide certain sufficient temperature, the carbon will diffuse out, will come out of this supersaturated solution and precipitates out as a carbide. And this carbide, interestingly, is not the carbide that comes out of this martensite is not cementite. Does anybody know what is that particular carbide that comes out? There is a name for it, and there is a definite crystal structure for it, and there is a definite stoichiometry for it. It is not cementite. Cementite is the one which comes out at a much higher temperature when you are tempering the martensite, because that particular carbide which is coming out first gets converted into cementite later. And what is that first carbide? It's called epsilon carbide. Has anybody heard of this thing called epsilon carbide? No? Okay. So that means you have not read about the tempering well. So if you go back once again to a book like Reed Hill or so, even you can go to Raghavan Physical Metallurgy book, you will see this information. So you will see that this is called epsilon carbide, and it has a hexagonal structure. It is Fe2.2C. And it has a hexagonal structure. The reason why I am saying this is, if I take this particular replica with those extracted particles, whether it is epsilon carbide or cementite, I can find out by getting the diffraction pattern from that particle and analyzing the diffraction pattern to find out whether it is hexagonal structure or orthorhombic structure, which is a structure for Fe3C. So this is one information that this particular extraction replicas give. But there is still one more information that I want to extract, which this particular extraction replicas do not give, and that's the reason why people have to go for the other things. The second information that I cannot get is, for example, if my sample has dislocations in it, okay, the extraction replicas will not give any information, because this is my sample. This is only a replica that I am seeing. It is not my sample that I am seeing. So I want to see dislocations inside my sample. The replicas do not give you information. Similarly, I also want to know whether this precipitate that I have is it a coherent precipitate, is it a semi-coherent precipitate, or is it an incoherent precipitate? You must have heard about these terms. So if it is a coherent precipitate, that means there is a orientation relationship between this precipitate and this matrix. And this orientation relationship is now lost, because here in this replica only I am picking up the particle. I don't have the matrix of my sample here, because I am not seeing the sample. I am only seeing the surface topography of my sample. surface roughness of my sample, and also in the process I am also picking up some particles from the sample. I am only getting information about the particle, but I will not know what is the relation between the matrix and the sample, whether there is any particular orientation relationship in terms of certain planes of the precipitate being parallel to certain planes of my matrix. That information I will not be able to get. And in order to get that, you need to actually see the actual sample rather than seeing a replica of the sample. So the whole replica techniques have been abandoned at some stage because they do not give you complete information about the sample. And particularly if my interest is to see even atomic resolutions in a sample, obviously I am not able to get those things, because long back the resolutions that people had are only of the order of, as I told you, about 1 nanometer or so. Original electron microscopes, the first electron microscope was 1932 by a person called Van Raska. This is a gentleman who has made the first TEM, transmission electron microscope, and that stage the kind of resolutions that they had with all the aberrations of the lenses that they had, they would not be getting anything beyond about 1 to 2 microns, 1 to 2 nanometers. Of course, that was better than an optical microscope, because optical microscope was only 200 nanometers or so. So it was still useful. But at that stage, because people's interest was not really to see the atomic structures or the high resolution images, which we call it now, where you can actually see how the atoms are arranged. And also, if I want to see, for example, if there is a short range order in my glass, let's say a glass which is here, the window glass, if I want to see a short range order, because I know liquids have short range order, and if the liquid is frozen into a glass, super cooled configurationally frozen liquid is a glass, and if I want to see that particular structure of the liquid, if I see this glass, I am able to see the structure of the liquid, because glass is nothing but a replica of my liquid, right? So if I understand the structure of a glass, I understand the structure of the liquid. So if I want to see such kind of information, that I want to see the clusters inside the liquid or the clusters inside the glass, which is what we call it as a short range order, this kind of replicas will not be able to give all that. So that's the reason why we had techniques of like this, and now people regularly use all these techniques to be able to see the samples. Now let's jump into the diffraction principles of electron diffraction when compared to the X-ray diffraction. As I mentioned to you in the previous class, that X-ray diffraction has one limitation, that if I have a sample, send an X-ray beam, it gets diffracted. This is what? Theta, and this is also theta. That's what we call it as Bragg's angle, right? So, and this diffracted beam, this is the incident beam, we call it. This is the diffracted beam. And by analyzing these diffracted beams that are coming out, and there are so many techniques we talked about, and among these techniques, the most popular technique nowadays is called powder diffraction. They call it as diffractometer. And in such a setup, what you get is you get a set of peaks like this as a function of 2 theta or theta, whatever it is. So certain intensity versus 2 theta, 2D kind of images, and in those 2D you will see certain peaks, and by analyzing these peaks I will be able to know what crystal structure it is and what are the lattice parameters of that particular crystal structure. I will be able to know. But this is all fine if I am talking of let's say a pure metal or a single phase material. For example, if I am talking about let's say pure iron, it's okay. Or if I am talking about a supersaturated solid solution of copper in aluminum, I have taken aluminum copper alloy 4% copper to a high temperature and solutionized it, quenched it. Now I have got this aluminum copper alloy where all the copper is dissolved in aluminum, And what will be the structure of it? If all the copper is dissolved into aluminum, what is the structure of FCC? The reason is correct. And the structure of aluminum is FCC. All of you should possibly know by now that the crystal structure of any solid solution is same as that of the solvent. Here our solvent is aluminum. Aluminum has a FCC structure, and that's the reason why, in many cases when, for example, if I take copper zinc case, you might be knowing that zinc dissolves into copper up to certain extent. How much? If you ever heard of copper zinc alloys, brasses, there's a large amount of solubility of zinc in copper. Anybody knows? Anybody has heard of it? Almost 38%. 38% of zinc goes into copper. But interestingly, on the other side, copper does not dissolve into zinc. This is a problem. That means copper likes zinc, but zinc does not like copper. Like a one-sided love story. So there are problems like that. There are reasons for it. I will not go into that. There are reasons related to valencies and things like that. But the point is, zinc, when it dissolves into copper, what is the crystal structure of zinc? HCP. And that of copper? FCC. So when zinc dissolves into copper, the solid solution that you get is an FCC solid solution. So zinc loses its crystal structure when it dissolves into it. And such a structure, now if I take a aluminum copper solid solution, which is a supersaturated solution, quenched it and you got that supersaturated solution, now I am doing the edge hardening. And some precipitate is coming out. And I have done edge hardening for a certain period, some amount of precipitate has come out. This precipitate, if I have to see it inside this, it should have certain amount of that precipitate for it to be detected by this X-ray. If the amount of the precipitate is very small, and to give you an example, yesterday we were talking about a steel. For example, if I take a 0.2% carbon steel, plain carbon steel, and try to find out how much of Fe3C is there in that, you will know that the amount of Fe3C in this is approximately only 3%. Just 3%. And 98%, 97% is only ferrite, and only cementite is just about 3%. And as a result, if I take such a 0.2% carbon steel, subject it to X-ray diffraction, I will only get peaks of iron, which are all peaks of ferrite, BCC ferrite. But the peaks of Fe3C, which is supposed to be there inside the material, I will see them as very, very small peaks, which almost get merged into a background noise. There is always some background noise because of the roughness of the sample. There is always some random scattering. However nicely polish your sample, you will have some roughness which is also causing some kind of a noise. And so these peaks are so small peaks, and they may get merged into this noise. And as a result, you may not be able to see these Fe3C very clearly. And as a result, you start feeling, is this really a steel that I am looking at, or am I looking at a pure iron? And somebody has given you a sample, asked you to put it into the TEM, into a X-ray diffraction, and tell me whether it is steel or not. You will not be able to tell whether it is steel or not. And if he also tells you, asks you, so please put it into the X-ray diffraction machine and tell me how much carbon content is there in the steel. I am giving you two steel. Let's say one is let's say 0.2% carbon, another is 0.4% carbon, and I want you to tell me which is what. You will not be able to see it very clearly because both of them will have such a small carbon contents. You may not, maybe 0.4% carbon steel, you may be able to see it, but 0.2% carbon steel is very difficult to see really in this. So as a result, X-ray diffraction has that limitation that phases which have small volume fractions cannot be easily seen. And also second factor that you cannot see is what I was just talking to you. If you have a sample with some precipitates in it, and there is an orientation relationship between the precipitate and the matrix, this information you will not be able to see. Whether these precipitates are coherent precipitates, or semi-coherent, or incoherent, why am I bothered about it? I am bothered about it because the properties of my alloy depend on that. If I do edge hardening and plot the hardness versus time, you see that this is the type of curve that I get, right? This curve tells you that I get a peak hardness somewhere here. And this peak hardness I get there because there is a particular type of precipitate that is coming there, which is usually a semi-coherent precipitate of theta double prime and theta prime. And if I go to longer times, I get theta here and the hardness falls because it's an incoherent precipitate. So as a result, I need to bother. If I have a sample which has certain strength, I have measured the hardness, and I want to correlate that hardness to the microstructure, I would like to see the microstructure and not only just see the precipitate, but also I would like to know what is that precipitate. Is this precipitate coherent or not coherent? So that finally I can talk. How is that now I am able to confidently say that it is semi-coherent precipitates which will give you this high strength? It is because I have been able to do microscopy of these samples which are aged for different timings, and they were all put into a TEM, and people were able to find out what are the crystal structures of these precipitates, not only finding out what is the sizes of these precipitates, but also being able to find out this kind of a orientation relationships, and from that find out whether they are coherent or semi-coherent. For example, if it is a semi-coherent precipitate, as I have mentioned yesterday, you will see what are called misfit dislocations. That means if you have a precipitate in a matrix, let's say I take an enlarged precipitate, let's say this is a precipitate, let us say, and I have certain atomic planes here inside the precipitate, and I have certain atomic planes inside my matrix, and I see wherever there is no matching, there is a dislocation there, and you will see some dislocations here because this is there is a plane in the precipitate, but there is no continuous plane in the matrix on the other side. So that means there is an extra plane of atoms below this plane, below this interface plane, and there is no corresponding set of atoms above this plane. So that is what we call it as an edge dislocation, right? So these dislocations are coming because of a mismatch between the matrix and the precipitate, and that's why we call them as misfit dislocations, because there is a misfit. When will this misfit dislocations vanish? When the lattice parameter of the matrix and that of precipitate, this goes to 0. The misfit is defined as this. Lattice parameter of the matrix minus the lattice parameter of the precipitate. In principle, it should be d, interplanar distance, but we know that interplanar distance is connected to the lattice parameter. Is there any formula between the interplanar distance and lattice parameter? D equal to a by root of s square plus k square plus l square. Is this a universal formula? No, not for simple cubic. It is for cubic. Whether it is simple cubic or BCC or FCC, for all three of them you can use that. So this is a formula for cubic. Similarly, there is another formula for some other crystal structures, and we have relations like that. So as a result, if I look at, if I call these as two cubic phases, let us say, I can see this, and if I express this as percentage, if this percentage is less than about 10%, I call them as coherent precipitates. That means the lattice parameters are very close to each other, and so they can maintain what is called continuity. If it is more, then I end up into what are called semi-coherent. If it is much larger than about 15% or so, then I get what are called incoherent precipitates. And all this is important because that influences my properties. And when can I see these dislocations? Only when I see both the matrix and the precipitate inside the TEM. So that's the reason why I would like to see that, and that XRD cannot show me, obviously, because XRD is only a diffractometer. It will only give you diffraction patterns, and it cannot give you anything else. And that can give you only bulk diffraction pattern, and it cannot give you a diffraction pattern from a precipitate. For example, if I have only, if I am started doing my edge hardening, and let's say just the precipitates have started forming. Let's say I have started doing tempering of my martensite. I have just Fe3C has formed, not Fe3C, let's say Fe2.2C, hexagonal cement, hexagonal, what is called epsilon carbide, and if this epsilon carbide is small particles, I want to find out the crystal structure of this. The volume fraction of these particles in the initial stages is very small, because unless they grow to whatever equilibrium volume fraction, whatever the number that I am calculating, this number I am calculating from the phase diagram. If I am calculating this from the phase diagram being an equilibrium diagram, unless the whole process is complete, if I have to do edge hardening at a particular temperature, whatever is the maximum amount of cementite that can evolve, unless that evolves, I am not able to get this particular percentage. So as a result, in the beginning of the transformation, you may have only a 0.5% or 1% of these precipitates which have just formed, and they have not yet completely grown to the size and volume fraction that they have. So at that stage, if I use an XRD, I may not be able to see any of this. So my XRD pattern may not be able to show any epsilon carbide at all. So this kind of a thing can be found out if I use a TEM. We will see how to see them in the TEM in the